Satoshi Nakamoto, the creator of Bitcoin, went to great lengths to conceal his identity. Just to recap, Satoshi used an obscure email service based out of Germany. Their P2P profile said they were from Japan. In the Bitcoin code, they name drop a newspaper from London. The PDF of the original Bitcoin white paper showed Satoshi's computer was set to Mountain Time Zone in the United States. And then we have an IP address used by Satoshi appearing to be from Van Nuys, California. What can we make of all this confusion? Well, it means that whoever was using the name Satoshi Nakamoto was already an expert in privacy long before they gave birth to Bitcoin. You might think, well, maybe it was multiple people around the world all working together that shared the Satoshi username, maybe an international team like Cicada 3301. But when you look through all of the Satoshi posts, you find that Satoshi had just one voice. They communicated their thought process, asked for help at times, admitted mistakes when caught, and then made corrections. You know, their posting went up and down in frequency throughout the years that Satoshi was active, but showed the same period of silence during the day, which shows us, yes, Satoshi did sleep. And being one person, not a team, would make it easier to keep the secret and gives us some explanation why their disappearance appears permanent. No invention can compare to Satoshi's Bitcoin, just historic. Yes, because their master plan to produce something and stay anonymous appears to have worked, but also just because how successful Bitcoin has become. I mean, just to look at the price for one Bitcoin today, it's insane. Even the most optimistic or deranged early Bitcoiner could not have predicted how Bitcoin would move markets and culture around the world. We can appreciate all the little steps Satoshi took even more today after this growth in price, users, computer power since 2009 that turned basically a computer experiment to this whale, this massive behemoth that threatens monetary policy for every modern government. So, I like looking into this stuff. Did Satoshi die? Did they just have self-control to give up their invention and take no credit, no fame? Perhaps something else. All we are left with are Satoshi's writings and small clues to let us guess who they were. People have put a lot of mental energy into this mystery. It would be so cool to have the chance to talk to Satoshi about Bitcoin of today, or just give him a little pat on the back, maybe get him a beer. It's just a very human thing to look for a leader, even if the point of Bitcoin is to be leaderless. So, whatever the reason, no one has figured it out yet. We have to guess. And I, more than most, have bought into a narrative that Satoshi is a humble, selfless, freedom-loving superhero. It would be extremely funny if, instead of Bitcoin being a master plan, that Bitcoin was an afterthought, a side project from a profoundly evil man. Instead of Satoshi being Japanese or European or American, what if Satoshi was African?
Welcome to the morning show. This is Andy Milanakis, and we are talking about Bitcoin and Bitcoin news. Welcome.
Anyone who could fit the profile of Satoshi is usually an interesting person, and Paul LaRue is perhaps the most interesting. So who is Paul? In 1972, Paul was born in Rhodesia, what we now call Zimbabwe, to a very young mother who put him up for adoption. There are internet rumors that his mother was an American, actually family of a United States senator. But the reality is we just don't know who his parents were, and unfortunately Paul didn't get to know either. His birth certificate just listed his name as unknown. He wasn't even given the dignity of a name. But Paul was lucky in that he was adopted by a family who gave him a name, cared for him, and were well off financially. Unfortunately, this part of Africa had a lot going on at this time. Racists often have this nostalgia for Rhodesia, as it had a small white minority in power over a land of mostly black, and the country went into turmoil once Mugabe took control. But any history major will tell you things are always more complicated than, this caused this. Regardless of who was right or how closely Paul was paying attention to politics at that young age, sometimes politics becomes impossible to ignore, and when safety issues began to arise, the family moved, and Paul was then raised in South Africa. And the way some people have an innate talent with music, chess, or mechanics, Paul had it with computers. And there are lots of anecdotes how Paul would choose to stay in his room on his computer instead of going out and socializing with others. When he was 17, this would have been around 1989, 1990, Paul's family took a vacation to the United States. And it's not clear what he experienced, but he saw something. He felt something. And once they got home, Paul said to his family that he was leaving. He packed his bags and flew to the UK and then to the US. Fast forward to 2012, and Paul is in a United States courtroom before the Honorable Judge Adams, who said, "There's no question in my mind that Paul LaRue deserves to spend the rest of his life in prison. The scope and severity of Mr. LaRue's criminal conduct is nothing short of breathtaking. I have before me a man who has engaged in conduct in keeping with the villain in a James Bond movie, a narcotics trafficker who admitted to killing 7 people. Could this be Satoshi?" Described as an introvert, Paul chose to stay inside playing video games instead of pursuing sports or touching grass. It's not like he was physically deformed or anything. Good-looking guy, but he just had no interest in socializing. But no one could call Paul unsuccessful. Paul made millions of dollars by being an early innovator selling pharmaceuticals online. He was able to use his programming expertise to set up websites, databases, and email servers to overwhelm the internet with spam, targeting people who wanted prescription drugs. He then set up a network of doctors, legitimate doctors who maybe were just looking for extra patients, and then connected these parties to pharmacies. So legit real businesses receiving real prescriptions and filling them for the customer. All things that existed previously, just organized now in a new questionable gray area way. In many ways, this was like Bitcoin. Satoshi took some pre-existing technologies and just organized them for people to use in a clever way, to get people to use it. Even as Paul's operation grew into other products like methamphetamine, heavy machinery, weapons, tuna, Paul was able to continue to work from home, instructing other people to do his things while he remained behind the scenes giving orders. There's a quote that when Paul was talking to his number two man, a guy named Dave Smith, he said, "I live through you." Paul was more comfortable being a faceless screen name. Dave Smith was doing crazy stuff for him, like throwing people off boats and dealing with mercenaries, while Paul kept distance. Probably because it was more in his nature, but also from a security perspective, the right thing to do. Again, some parallel with Satoshi. Satoshi pushed other faces forward as the point person for Bitcoin. Once Bitcoin appeared healthy, he replaced his name on the Bitcoin website with Gavin Andresen as the main contact. Obviously, many people are introverts, and you're allowed to be private online, but the similarities go further than that. Encryption for the masses was a software from the late 90s that did exactly what the name describes. It let anyone encrypt their data, assuming you were a Windows user. This was created by Paul and given out for free. So anyone could use this to be more private. Encryption for the masses did not care who you are, where you're from, what you did. If you check out the old Encryption for the Masses website, Paul even penned a little speech, a little manifesto detailing the government's use of computers to overreach and control citizens, and why it was important for people to use those very same computers to fight back in the name of freedom. This could easily pass for a cypherpunk manifesto. And when Satoshi introduced Bitcoin, they provided the same kind of argument and history lesson. Satoshi posted February 11th, 2009, "Privacy could always be overridden by the admin based on his judgment call, weighing the principles of privacy against other concerns, or at the behest of his superiors. Then strong encryption became available to the masses." That's an interesting choice of words. "And trust was no longer required. Data could be secured in a way that was physically impossible for others to access, no matter for what reason, no matter how good the excuse, no matter what." Paul Roux never really gets named as one of the cypherpunks, but there were thousands of individuals posting under different names on that early mailing list. Paul easily could have been lurking on there, given his computer background, and would know this is the place to find an audience for Bitcoin. This is the place to post the Bitcoin white paper for people who could, one, understand the technology, and two, understand the importance of finding a decentralized digital money. Evan Ratliff, arguably the greatest researcher on Paul Roux, interviewed a lot of people who used to work for him. One who recalled a conversation he had with Paul, where he basically said, if we're trying to make money, why don't we just do what the North Koreans do and just print cash with money machines? And Paul replied, or just make your own currency. It's a nice quote, and of course it's secondhand, but the point remains, Paul had motivation to make a digital currency. With businesses all over the world and living all over the world, he had first-hand knowledge of the complexity and frustration in transferring money. Probably not surprising that he was into gold. Evan Ratliff detailed how Paul was using ships to move gold around and stored it in sketchy trap houses. I mean, that obviously would be complex and frustrating. Bitcoin, or something that could act as digital gold, would help solve a lot of problems. Before his trafficking empire, Paul also worked as a programmer for a Dutch and Australian bank, setting up protocols for international bank transfer systems. The man was truly an international man of mystery. Passports in multiple countries, he had fake businesses in Brazil, real businesses in Manila, multiple side deals going on at the same time. It can seem overwhelming for us plebs to consider managing multiple identities, but if nothing else, Paul clearly could compartmentalize. He gave detailed instructions to his employees on how to use encryption, burner emails, proxy services, obviously practicing what he preached. But out of all the different identities Paul had, it was really this passport that caused pandemonium in the Bitcoin community. People went nuts. Paul Satoshi Calder LaRue. Satoshi? What the hell kind of name is that? It was issued in 2008, just weeks before Satoshi began sharing the Bitcoin white paper with people online. One of Paul's minions, who paid the bribe or the fee for the passport in the Congo, clarified that Paul did not actually pick that name. It was the government official in the Congo who printed this that picked the Satoshi name. And something I learned is that Satoshi is actually somewhat common Congolese name, and that putting that name in there added more legitimacy to the passport. It's crazy that this could have influenced Paul to pick the name Satoshi. And we would have never seen this if Paul had not been arrested and had all his dirt dug up for the world to see. We would have never seen this passport had he not walked into a sting operation in Liberia back in 2012. His arrest could provide clarity on some unanswered Satoshi questions. Satoshi stopping their communication could have been for a million different reasons, but being held in custody would certainly be an explanation that makes sense. The Bitcoin that Satoshi mined in the early days, worth a lot of money back then, but if we consider it from Paul's perspective, it really wouldn't be the biggest priority. He was already wealthy. Also, if he was detained, he wouldn't be able to dump the coins on the market, even if he wanted to. All these people praising Satoshi for not touching his money, and it could just be because he's stuck in prison. It's compelling stuff, and as long as you can get over the premise of Satoshi being an international criminal, definitely worth thinking about. Plus, an interesting quirk in the Bitcoin code was the earliest version had language in there for a potential poker playing software. Paul had developed gambling software. Usually the poker thing is just skipped over when talking about Bitcoin and Satoshi because it never really went anywhere, and I don't know, it just seems kind of random. Paul's one of the few Satoshi candidates that makes the poker thing make sense. Evan Ratliff, who I name-dropped earlier, literally wrote the book on Paul LaRue. The Mastermind is 480 pages detailing Paul's life, and it was only after all the research was done and the book is published that the internet really started to believe in the Paul Satoshi theory. And Evan brought this up in interviews that when the speculation was getting hot, he basically had this panic attack with potential embarrassment. Like, how could I have missed this? That in all of this research, flying around the world to interview people, that he somehow failed to pick up on the invention of Bitcoin. Wrote a book that left out such an interesting part of Paul LaRue's life. So Evan started another round of research with the angle that Paul could be Satoshi. He came to the conclusion that there's not enough there. It's not that Paul couldn't possibly have been Satoshi, because he certainly had technology skills and was an intelligent guy, but aside from hypotheticals, there really just isn't meat there. And if Evan Ratliff wasn't able to make it work as a story, it really should make us start to question the theory. If Paul had a massive number of LLCs and businesses doing all these online transactions every day, why would 0 of these businesses accept Bitcoin? Why would Satoshi Nakamoto go through all this work to create and promote Bitcoin adoption and then not offer Bitcoin as an option for his customers to use? Paul's empire was able to survive and thrive by a lot of clever management decisions, but when it came to money, he still used traditional banking. A criminal mastermind, or even a regular mind who knew about Bitcoin, would at some point have diversified. Perhaps he had some Bitcoin wallets tucked away somewhere, but remember, the United States government completed a successful investigation and prosecution of Paul. If there was Bitcoin there, they would have found it. I know I hyped Paul up, and he obviously deserves credit for an ability to cover his tracks, but say he destroyed the Satoshi identity perfectly, cut all ties, and even went as far as giving up any Bitcoin that can be connected to Satoshi. Would he really have no desire to use his invention ever again? To truly have no skin in the game? The DEA worked for months, flipping Paul's ex-employees to cooperate against him, tracked his shipments, seized assets. Prosecutors want to keep the focus of their investigation narrow to get a conviction, but when it comes to money, they want it all. You know every stone was getting turned over. That yacht Paul had, he doesn't get to keep that thing when he gets out of prison. Collecting assets of a criminal empire is always a nice perk for law enforcement, and if there was Bitcoin there, they wouldn't just ignore it. Paul being in jail could be an explanation for why Satoshi disappeared, but an important clarification is that Satoshi stopped communicating and said goodbye before Paul was arrested. Satoshi made it clear that they were walking away from the project regardless, unless it was part of a master plan to show up in Liberia and get arrested, lose everything, and live in a cell for potentially forever. It's more likely that this timeline is just coincidence. Paul, smart guy, yes, he made some smart deals with the US prosecutors, but his life is screwed up even if he gets out in the US. Other countries can still prosecute and have him serve sentences over there. So Paul hasn't had freedom in some time, but during a sentencing in 2020, Paul was able to make a statement to the judge about what he might do if he gets a chance to be released. And he did the strangest thing. He wrote a letter explaining what Bitcoin is to the judge and that he wanted to get into Bitcoin mining. A wild strategy if you're trying to get out of prison early, because, what do the courts care about? Recidivism. They don't want someone to do the same crimes again. So if you're trying to make the case that you are no longer an international trafficker, why in the world would you tell a judge, I'm into digital money that can't be confiscated? It's also strange because why would Satoshi say this? If Paul is Satoshi, Why would you go to these great lengths to distance yourself from the project, and the one chance you get to speak publicly, you draw attention to yourself using Bitcoin? I think it's because since his arrest, Paul probably did get into Bitcoin, both because it's interesting for someone like him, and he's probably now aware of rumors that he could be connected to its creation. For any narcissist, that would be awesome. So, Paul used his opportunity to go before the judge, not to say, "I'm sorry, I won't do any illegal business again." Instead, to nerd out and write a letter explaining what Bitcoin is to a judge. And if you take a look at this letter, it's hard to think this is the writing of Satoshi. Satoshi presented Bitcoin to people so many times in 2008, 9, and 10, and even those early explanations are better than what Paul was able to articulate. The Bitcoin white paper was very academic. Satoshi forum posts were always clear and concise. Paul is very non-academic, and writing samples from old message boards show a very different writing style with misspellings all over the place. It's easier to be a good writer and pretend to be bad than the other way around, if that makes sense. I take nothing away from Paul and his apparent savant level of self-taught business skills, but even if you are an expert in time management, Bitcoin required major investment in both time and labor. Whoever wrote under the Satoshi name devoted an enormous amount of time developing, troubleshooting, and just talking with early Bitcoin users. Much of Satoshi's personality was intentionally clouded, but what we do know is that they were consistent. The hours of the day they posted were surprisingly consistent. This gap doesn't really give us a location for Satoshi, because maybe they were a night owl, maybe they worked during the day, maybe it was an after work and after school thing. But either way, this is a very different description than Paul LaRue. Paul was described as working off his laptop all around the world. He had stuff going on with the London Metal Exchange, arms deals in Africa. He was doing logging operations. He worked most of the day, rarely slept. Paul actually could have been in a great position to hide an identity because he was always traveling, always working. It would make analysis like this almost impossible. Satoshi, whoever they were, appeared to have some stability in life. Yes, Satoshi did not give us much evidence to go off, but based on these timestamps, Satoshi was not a Bond villain, as cool a story that may be. The media, or at least Bitcoin media, loves Satoshi stories. They get views, they get clicks, even with flimsy information. A couple of years ago, it was reported on that a message had been sent on the Bitcoin blockchain with the text, "This transaction was made by Paul LaRue to Hal Finney on January 12th, 2009. Hashtag Bitcoin." Whoever this was did actually have access to a very old Bitcoin address. But as it was pointed out by actual Bitcoin developers, this type of signature, this type of transaction did not exist in the early days of Bitcoin. It could have been done by anyone retroactively. And I mean, writing hashtag Bitcoin should have already raised some skepticism. Anyone who wound up with old coin could have written that. I know when something gets imprinted on the blockchain, it can feel like it has some weight behind it. But people have been using the Bitcoin blockchain to write stupid stuff forever. If you use different block explorers, you can find all kinds of interesting messages. People love to stir the pot. There's lots of vague statements mentioning Satoshi, shouting out different people. talking about 9/11. The fact that there is a message on the blockchain hinting about Paul is really just proof there are people out there trying to make this a thing. Same could be said during Craig Wright's trial. A lot of people got excited that Paul LaRue's name was mentioned in a court filing by Craig in his never-ending journey to prove he was the one who invented Bitcoin. Craig has thrown a bunch of things against the wall, trying to make things stick. He said Dave Kleinman helped with Bitcoin, who was conveniently dead. He said Gareth Williams helped, also conveniently dead. Craig just says stuff. So the fact that Paul was mentioned too in his court filing is just fluff, more hearsay. People want to try and make Paul fit into the Satoshi identity, but when you really try to make it work, you're left looking for more. I like looking into these candidates because you get a better appreciation for Bitcoin and its origin story. But I really don't think Paul LaRue deserves to be on the list of Satoshi candidates. One, because I don't think he is Satoshi. And two, because he's not a good person. I know we joke around a bit and some time has passed since Paul's crimes have taken place, but the man should not be celebrated. It was reported he was trying to bribe or donate to the Mugabe administration in Zimbabwe to get white farmers back their lands. And I mean, if this was a movie, maybe you could view Paul amassing this great wealth and empire just as a means to right some perceived wrong he experienced as a child. That the little boy with no name, who had to move around, unable to build connections, was just trying to return to some past that may or may not have even existed. But then you read some messages that were leaked from his trial, like, need to come up with white chick, promised it to a government minister there for some bribe in Papua New Guinea, just trafficking people like they are property. And you realize this isn't a movie. He hurt people. He has no moral compass. And he will face consequences for his actions in this life or the next. Satoshi is worth remembering, not Paul. Thanks for watching.